Democratic Congressman Hakeem Jeffries is beginning to speak out on how he'll be carrying the party's agenda moving forward now that House Speaker Nancy Pelosi is stepping back from her leadership post. On CNN State of the Union, Jeffries addressed one challenge as the likely new minority leader, dealing with a Republican-controlled House.
There is going to be, because of the narrow majority that House Republicans are going to have, the far right wing, the MAGA caucus, is going to be empowered and emboldened. It's going to make it tougher for McCarthy to govern as Speaker if he does, in fact, become Speaker. If Kevin McCarthy needs votes to pass essential legislation, such as keeping the government open or raising the debt limit, will Democrats be willing to help him if the Freedom Caucus folks, the Marjorie Taylor Greenes of the world, refuse to participate?
Well, it seems to me that that's a case-by-case basis, but Democrats have always been willing to lean in on making sure that we fully fund the government, and Democrats have always been willing to lean in and making sure that we meet our nation's obligations and do not default on our debt for the first time in American history. I think it's also important to point out, Jake, that we have consistently fought against extremism on the Republican side, including when it manifested itself often during the former president's tenure, while at the same time being able to find common ground to make progress for the American people.
And joining me now is a man who has held many titles in his career, including Secretary of Defense, CIA Director, White House Chief of Staff. He also served 16 years in the House. Leon Panetta, thanks so much for being with us once again. Let me start with President Biden and what the Democrats are facing. GOP-controlled House, where Kevin McCarthy, because of his slim majority, is facing pressure from far-right members who want to investigate everything from the Biden family business dealings to the Afghanistan withdrawal to the FBI search at Mar-a-Lago. If you're in Ron Klain's shoes over there at the White House, what are you thinking looking down Pennsylvania Avenue right now?
Well, the most important question to answer is whether or not the Republicans are interested in governing, or are they interested in raising hell? I think the message coming out of these midterms is that the American people are tired of extremism. They're tired of undermining our democracy. They really do want both parties to work together in order to govern. And so I think it's very important for the White House to try to reach out to the Republicans, obviously to the Democratic leadership, and see whether or not there's a willingness to work together on major issues facing the country. That'll be the test, not only for the Congress, but for the White House.
And if not, I mean, could this be a godsend to Joe Biden if he's thinking about running for re-election?
Well, I was chief of staff when the Congress went Republican after the first 2 years of the Clinton administration. And although the president obviously was despondent at the time, he also recognized that it might be an opportunity to be able to work together with Republicans and try to get some things done. And that's exactly what happened. And it led to the president's reelection. So I think that President Biden understands that message. I think, in his guts, he wants to be able to see if he can try to work with both sides to get things done. He knows that the purpose of being president, the purpose of being elected, is to try to solve the problems in the country. So I think President Biden is going to try to explore opportunities for trying to see if there can be compromise.
And in a single week, we learned that former President Donald Trump was running for president again, and that a special counsel had been appointed to investigate both his actions around the January 6th attack and his handling or mishandling of classified documents taken to Mar-a-Lago. Trump had this response. Let's listen.
This horrendous abuse of power is the latest in a long series of witch hunts. They want to do bad things to the greatest movement in the history of our country, but in particular, bad things to me.
I guess adding to that, his tweets leading up to January 6th are visible again because his Twitter account was restored by Elon Musk. What do you think? I mean, are we seeing the potential for Trump to wreak more havoc over the next couple of years?
Well, I don't think there's any question. That's the way Trump operates, is through chaos and through havoc. And as you heard in his remarks, there's absolutely no kind of argument with regards to his innocence or with regards to the charges that are being investigated. He's just basically accusing whoever is investigating him of being political. I think that the reality is that this president, President Trump, has to be held accountable for the things that he did. And he has spent a lifetime avoiding accountability. And he's going to try to do that again by trying to just raise chaos in the political world. I think that game has been overplayed by President Trump. And I think the American people recognize that. And I don't think it's going to play the same way it's played in the past.
Do you think the Attorney General, Merrick Garland, was being a tad too cautious in naming a special counsel?
Well, he was in a difficult position no matter what he did. If he went ahead with the prosecution on his own, I'm sure that President Trump would make the same accusations against the Attorney General. On the other hand, I do think that, frankly, in order to be fair and objective in this investigation, a special counsel, I believe, is warranted. It's going to take some additional time. I recognize that. But I really do think that the better course here is to have a special counsel handle the prosecution on both Mar-a-Lago as well as January 6th.
I want to move to another story. The U.S. has determined that the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman should be granted immunity in a case brought against him by the fiancé of Jamal Khashoggi, the Washington Post journalist who the Biden administration has said was murdered at the prince's direction. The argument was that MBS is a sitting head of government, but the reaction has been fierce. Amnesty International saying the U.S. government should, quote, hang its head in shame. This is nothing more than a sickening, total deep betrayal. What's your take on this?
Well, I think what the administration did, what the White House did, was to basically follow precedent in this situation with regards to a world leader. Now, it doesn't mean that they have to give up in terms of putting pressure on the head of Saudi Arabia, particularly with regards to the Khashoggi matter. I do think that there are other ways to approach this in terms of making sure that the full story comes out as to what happened. I understand, though, the precedent issue. When you start deciding to prosecute the head of a nation, it can backfire on a lot of countries, including the United States. So I understand the reasoning for why they took the position they did, but it is not an excuse for letting up on the pressure that has to be brought on Prince Salman for what happened with Khashoggi.
All right, Leon Panetta, great to have those insights. As always, we appreciate your time.
Thank you. Good to be with you, Jim.
All right, good to see you.